It was a bright morning, and the airport was buzzing with travelers. In the middle of the crowd, a woman walked calmly toward the first-class gate. She was dressed in a stunning, expensive dress, the kind that caught the eye of anyone who saw it. Her heels clicked softly on the floor as she made her way toward the gate, her confidence radiating from every step. Though she was beautiful, she didn't seek attention. She simply moved through the crowd like someone who was used to being in the spotlight. She had a quiet presence about her, a calm that made her seem different from the usual passengers. Her eyes were focused ahead, but there was a hint of something deeper in her gaze. The woman didn't look like someone who needed to impress. She knew exactly who she was. It wasn't arrogance, it was strength, maturity, and a sense of peace that could only come from experience. Yet, as she walked down the terminal, no one seemed to notice her, and that was how she liked it. People were too busy rushing to catch their flights or checking their phones to give her a second glance. In the chaos of the airport, she was just another person heading to the gate. But little did they know, the woman was much more than just someone heading to a destination. She was a justice of the United States Supreme Court, a powerful figure in the law, but no one could tell by looking at her. Her journey to this moment had been long, filled with challenges, but she had always held her head high. She had fought for what was right, making decisions that affected millions of people. Now, though, she was just a woman, traveling to visit family. She didn't want any special treatment. She just wanted to relax and enjoy the flight. As she reached the gate, she smiled to herself, ready for the calm of her seat on the plane. As she entered the plane and showed her ticket, the flight attendant took a brief glance at her. The woman greeted the flight attendant with a polite smile. But the attendant's gaze lingered a little too long on her dress, almost with an air of judgment. It wasn't obvious at first, but there was something about the flight attendant's expression that seemed out of place. The attendant didn't recognize the woman and didn't seem to care who she was. Instead, she made a quick, almost dismissive note of her appearance. The woman walked down the aisle of the plane, scanning for her seat. She passed several other passengers who didn't seem to notice her at all. They were too busy with their own conversations or lost in their screens. No one knew that the woman they had just passed was one of the most respected and influential figures in the country. She sat down in her first-class seat, settling in and buckling up. The flight was going to be long, but it wasn't the flight that was on her mind. It was the peace she sought during the next few hours, the escape from the noise of the world, even if just for a little while. But what she didn't know was that the peace she hoped for was about to be disturbed by someone who didn't see her for who she truly was. Little did she know, the flight attendant had already made up her mind about her, and that was going to cause some serious trouble. As the woman settled into her seat, the flight attendant moved through the aisles, preparing for takeoff. Her name was Lisa, and she had been a flight attendant for several years. Over time, she had developed a certain way of looking at people. Some she saw as important, others as ordinary, and there were those she felt deserved special treatment. Lisa's attitude wasn't always kind, and her assumptions about people often led her to make quick judgments. When Lisa first laid eyes on the woman in the first-class seat, she couldn't help but notice the expensive dress. It was elegant, with delicate fabrics and intricate stitching. Lisa's eyes narrowed slightly as she took in the woman's calm demeanor. She immediately thought the woman was probably some rich, entitled socialite who expected the world to revolve around her. Lisa had dealt with high-profile passengers before, and she often found them to be demanding and difficult to please. As she walked past the woman's seat, she made a quick mental note to keep an eye on her. There was something about her that seemed too perfect, too polished. She couldn't help but feel a little irritated. She thought, why does she get to wear that dress? In her mind, the woman was just another person who thought they were better than everyone else. Lisa didn't know her story, didn't know who she really was. She was only seeing the surface, the polished exterior that made the woman look like someone who thought they were above others. The flight attendant also noticed how the woman seemed so calm, as though she wasn't concerned with anything. In Lisa's eyes, it made the woman look even more self-important. So Lisa began to think of small ways to make the woman's experience a little less pleasant. She would give her curt answers and maybe offer service a little slower than the others. After all, she assumed this woman had probably never faced any real struggles in life. She likely had everything handed to her on a silver platter. So what harm could a little attitude from the flight attendant do? As the flight took off and the cabin crew began serving drinks, Lisa walked down the aisle again. She couldn't help herself. She made a point to stop in front of the woman's seat. With a forced smile, she asked, "Can I get you anything to drink?" The woman politely replied, "I'll have some water, please." Lisa's smile was tighter than before. Just water, she thought. It seemed so plain, so normal, compared to the woman's luxurious appearance. Lisa almost felt like she had to show that she was in charge of the situation, even if it was just in small ways. She handed the water to the woman a little too quickly and continued down the aisle, already thinking about how she could avoid giving her too much attention. But the more she thought about it, the more she began to make assumptions about the woman. Lisa wondered how someone could be so calm, so composed in her seat, without even a hint of stress. In her mind, people who looked like they had everything were always looking for ways to show off. She believed that rich people like the woman in the dress were never satisfied and always wanted more, expecting the world to bow to their needs. What Lisa didn't realize was that her assumptions about the woman couldn't have been more wrong. If only she knew who the woman really was, she would have understood the true strength and dignity the woman carried with her. But instead, Lisa's judgment clouded her perception, setting the stage for an incident that neither of them would ever forget. The flight was now cruising comfortably at an altitude where the sounds of the engines had settled into a soft hum. Most passengers had settled into their seats, some reading books, others quietly watching the in-flight entertainment. The woman, still calm and composed, leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a brief moment of relaxation. She wasn't one to draw attention to herself, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Lisa, the flight attendant, continued with her usual rounds. She moved through the aisles, offering drinks and checking on passengers, but there was a noticeable coldness in her manner when she passed the woman. Her smile had become even tighter, almost forced. At first, she had been professional, but now there was something else, something that hinted at judgment. As Lisa passed by the woman's seat again, she noticed her calm demeanor once more. The woman was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes closed. To Lisa, this only added to her growing irritation. It seemed like the woman was so self-assured, so perfect, as if she thought she was better than everyone else. In contrast, Lisa, with her years of experience in customer service, had learned to spot the little signs of stress or frustration in passengers. But not this woman. She was too composed. What's she hiding? Lisa wondered. As the flight went on, Lisa's attitude began to show more clearly. When a few other passengers asked for things, she was quick to respond. But when the woman politely asked for a blanket, there was a noticeable delay. Lisa didn't rush to fetch it. She made a point to walk slowly, and when she returned, her movements were deliberately distant. The woman had noticed the difference in treatment. She had been on many flights before and had never been treated like this, but she didn't let it bother her. She simply smiled and thanked Lisa when the blanket was finally handed over. However, she couldn't ignore the odd behavior anymore. Something wasn't right, and it wasn't just the slow service. It was the way Lisa looked at her, the small, passive gestures that were building a quiet but palpable tension between them. The other passengers, who had been focused on their own activities, began to sense the unease as well. There was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, but no one was sure why. Some passengers exchanged glances, wondering why Lisa had been so distant with the woman in first class. Others, who had been busy reading or watching movies, started to notice the strange, almost judgmental look Lisa had been giving her. The woman, however, remained composed. She wasn't about to let anyone disturb her peace. She had been through much worse in life than a flight attendant's subtle hostility, and yet she couldn't help but feel a growing discomfort. It was as if the tension in the cabin was building, and she was the target without even knowing why. As the flight continued, Lisa's actions became bolder. She began making small, passive-aggressive comments about the woman's dress, though nothing too overt. She casually mentioned how expensive-looking the fabric seemed, as if to imply that the woman was flaunting her wealth. The woman, who had heard her tone, simply nodded politely and ignored the remark, deciding not to engage in any confrontation. But it wasn't just the woman's grace that kept her from reacting. It was something deeper. She had been in situations like this before, where prejudice and assumptions clouded people's judgment. She had faced discrimination in many forms over the years, but her response had always been the same: a calm, measured approach. She knew that sometimes the best way to handle such things was to rise above them, not let them get under her skin. Despite this, she couldn't help but feel the growing tension that now filled the air. It wasn't just the uncomfortable stares or the slow service. It was something more, something that would soon lead to an unexpected confrontation. Little did she know, her composure was about to be tested in ways she could never have imagined. The flight had been smooth up until this point, with only the occasional hum of the engines and the soft murmur of conversations in the background. But the atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted. A quiet tension hung in the air, one that seemed to grow stronger with every minute. Lisa, the flight attendant, continued her rounds, but now her behavior had become even more noticeable. She would glance at the woman in first class as she passed by, her expression colder than before. It wasn't just the slow service or the subtle remarks anymore. It was something more personal. The woman could feel the shift, and though she had tried to ignore it, it was becoming impossible to do so. She had traveled many times before, but this was different. She had grown used to being judged by others, people who didn't know her, didn't understand her. But this time, it felt more direct, more intentional. Lisa wasn't just treating her as a passenger, she was treating her as if she didn't belong. It wasn't just the flight attendant's attitude that bothered the woman. It was the underlying assumption that she was somehow lesser, undeserving of the respect she was entitled to. As the woman sat in her seat, she made an effort to stay calm, knowing that responding to hostility with hostility would only make things worse. But even the most composed individuals have their limits. There's only so much judgment, so much condescension, that anyone can take before it pushes them to act. And today that limit was getting closer and closer. It was just after the meal service that the situation escalated. The flight attendant, who had been moving about the cabin with a certain air of superiority, suddenly approached the woman's seat. Without any warning or preamble, she reached down and, in a quick, rough motion, grabbed the woman's dress as if it were an object to be discarded. Lisa tugged at the fabric, assuming it was caught on something, but in her haste and irritation, she didn't stop to think about the consequences of her actions. The woman gasped in shock as the flight attendant ripped the expensive dress from her, exposing her underneath. She stood up quickly, her heart racing with the suddenness of the action. For a moment, she couldn't believe what had just happened. Lisa had crossed a line that couldn't be ignored. The woman's face was calm, but her eyes flashed with an intensity that made it clear she would not tolerate being treated this way. Lisa, meanwhile, stood frozen, realizing instantly what she had done. She had acted without thinking, assuming that this woman, who had done nothing to provoke her, was just another passenger to be dealt with. But now, as she looked up into the woman's steady, unwavering gaze, she realized that she had made a grave mistake. The cabin fell silent. Passengers around them watched in stunned silence, unsure of what to do. The woman's composed demeanor only made the moment more intense. She didn't shout, didn't demand anything. She simply stood there, the ripped dress in her hands, and met Lisa's eyes. For a brief moment, no one moved. The tension was so thick that it felt like time had slowed down. The woman, still holding her dress, finally spoke. "You've made a mistake," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "and you will answer for it." The words weren't angry, but there was a weight to them that no one could ignore. Lisa, now realizing the gravity of her actions, began to stutter an apology. She didn't know who the woman was, but she could sense that this wasn't going to be an easy situation to resolve. The flight attendant's hands trembled as she stood there, not knowing what to say or how to fix what she had just done. The other passengers, who had been watching silently, now shifted in their seats. They began to whisper among themselves, some shaking their heads, others looking at the woman in disbelief. The woman's next move would reveal a truth that none of them were prepared for. The cabin was filled with an uneasy silence, as if the entire plane had held its breath. The woman stood there, still holding the torn piece of her dress, her gaze never leaving the flight attendant. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Passengers who had been quietly minding their own business just moments ago now looked on in confusion and surprise. No one knew what was happening, but everyone could feel that something major was unfolding before them. Lisa, the flight attendant, stood frozen, unable to move. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling as she realized the enormity of her mistake. She had never expected this. She had never expected the woman to react the way she had. And she certainly hadn't expected the calm, composed figure before her to be someone so important. For a few long moments, there was only silence. Then the woman took a deep breath and, without raising her voice, spoke. "I'm Justice, name," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I sit on the Supreme Court of the United States." The words hung in the air, and the effect they had on the cabin was instant. Passengers who had been watching the scene unfold now sat up straight, eyes wide in shock. They were all stunned by the revelation. No one had recognized her, not even Lisa. The woman, who had been treated with such disregard, was one of the highest-ranking figures in the country. Lisa's face turned even more pale as the truth sunk in. She had no idea who the woman was. She had treated her with disdain, assuming she was just another wealthy, entitled passenger. But now that assumption seemed foolish, even reckless. The woman wasn't just any passenger. She was someone whose decisions affected millions of lives. She was a pillar of the country's justice system, and Lisa had just disrespected her in the most humiliating way possible. The other passengers exchanged looks, some shaking their heads, others staring in disbelief. How could they have missed it? How could they not have known who she was? It seemed like such an obvious mistake now, but no one had recognized her in the moment. Her calmness, her grace, had made her blend in so seamlessly that no one had bothered to look closer. Lisa's mouth moved, but no words came out. She stammered, trying to find the right thing to say, but it was too late for apologies. She could feel the weight of her actions, the crushing realization that she had treated someone with the highest level of respect in the worst possible way. Her fingers fumbled nervously at her uniform, trying to straighten it out as if the act could somehow fix what she had done. The woman, still holding the torn dress, simply stood there, her face soft but firm. She didn't raise her voice, didn't shout, but her presence was enough. It was clear that she wasn't angry, at least not in the way the flight attendant might have expected. There was no fury in her eyes, only calm understanding. She wasn't here to escalate the situation, but she wasn't going to let it slide either. "Do you realize what you've done?" the woman asked, her tone measured, but serious. Lisa nodded slowly, unable to speak, her eyes glued to the floor. She had no excuse, no defense. She knew she had made a huge mistake, and there was nothing she could do to undo it. The woman sighed, taking another deep breath. "You'll answer for this," she said quietly, her gaze never leaving Lisa's face. It wasn't a threat. It was simply a statement of fact. The woman would make sure that what had happened would be addressed, and Lisa knew, deep down, that she would not escape the consequences of her actions. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The woman stood in the middle of the aisle, her torn dress still in her hands, while Lisa, the flight attendant, stood frozen, her face a mixture of shock and regret. It was as if time had slowed down, and everyone in the cabin was waiting for the next move. The passengers were unsure of what would happen next, but they all knew one thing for certain. This was no ordinary confrontation. The woman's calmness in the face of such disrespect was almost unsettling. She didn't shout, didn't demand an apology. Instead, she stood tall and composed, her gaze fixed on Lisa. She wasn't angry, but there was an undeniable weight to her presence. It was clear that she expected a certain level of respect, not because of her position, but because every person deserved to be treated with dignity. And that was what Lisa had failed to understand. Lisa, meanwhile, couldn't seem to find her voice. She had never been in a situation like this before. In all her years of working as a flight attendant, she had dealt with all kinds of passengers, some demanding, some rude, some even rude and difficult to handle. But this was different. She had crossed a line that she couldn't undo. Her assumptions and judgment had led to an unimaginable mistake, and she now had to face the consequences. The other passengers, who had been silent until now, began to exchange glances. Some were embarrassed for Lisa, others were surprised by the woman's calm reaction. No one spoke, but it was clear that the incident had created a stir. There was a quiet sense of disbelief among the people in the cabin. How could the flight attendant have been so careless? How had she missed the clues that could have told her who the woman truly was? A few passengers shifted nervously in their seats, but no one seemed to know how to address the situation. The woman's calm and collected demeanor made it clear that she wasn't interested in causing a scene. She wasn't here to escalate things, but she also wasn't going to let the flight attendant's actions go unaddressed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the woman spoke again, her voice softer than before, but still firm. "I'm not looking for an apology from you, but I do expect respect. We all deserve it, no matter who we are or how we appear on the outside." Her words were simple, but they carried a powerful message. She wasn't asking for special treatment or sympathy. She was simply stating a fact. Every human being deserved to be treated with respect. And no one, no matter their status, appearance, or background, should be subjected to disrespect. Lisa, still standing motionless, slowly nodded. She had heard the woman's words, but it was clear that she didn't know how to respond. She had failed to treat this woman with the respect she deserved, and now she was left facing the consequences of her actions. She had no idea who the woman was at first, but now that she knew, it was too late. She had already made her assumptions, and it was something that could not be undone with a simple apology. The silence stretched on, heavy and thick, as Lisa struggled to find her words. She had wanted to avoid confrontation, but now she had found herself in the middle of one she could not escape from. The woman's composure was still unwavering, and for a moment, Lisa simply stood there, unsure of what to do next. It was clear now that this wasn't just about a torn dress. It was about respect, something that had been broken and now needed to be restored. But how? What would happen next? The tension was so thick that even the air seemed heavy, and everyone in the cabin waited, hoping for some resolution, but not knowing what it would look like. The silence in the cabin continued, lingering like an unspoken weight. Lisa, the flight attendant, could feel the eyes of every passenger on her, and it made her stomach churn. She had been a professional for so long, handling countless passengers with ease, but now she felt completely out of her depth. She had made a mistake that couldn't be ignored, and the woman's calm yet firm presence only reminded her of how far she had gone wrong. For the longest time, Lisa stood there, frozen in place, unable to find the right words. She opened her mouth once, but no sound came out. The woman still stood before her, unmoved and steady. It was clear that she wasn't about to raise her voice or make a scene. She wasn't interested in fighting, but there was an undeniable sense of authority in her silence. She expected something from Lisa, something that could repair the damage that had been done. Lisa's hands trembled slightly as she tried to regain her composure. Her mind raced. She had never imagined a situation like this. She had assumed, wrongly, that she could judge a person based on their appearance. She had thought that the woman in the expensive dress was just another rich person who didn't care about anyone else. Now she was standing before someone who was more than she could have ever guessed, someone whose influence and importance reached far beyond what Lisa had realized. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lisa spoke. Her voice was shaky, but it carried the weight of her regret. I'm so sorry," she said, her eyes meeting the woman's, filled with genuine remorse. "I was wrong. I assumed things about you, and I treated you unfairly. I don't know what I was thinking, but I should never have done that." The woman remained silent for a moment, still holding her torn dress in her hands. Lisa could see that the woman wasn't angry, at least not in the way she might have expected. Instead, there was a quiet strength in her gaze. She wasn't going to make this easy for Lisa, but she wasn't going to let the flight attendant off the hook either. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," Lisa continued, her voice now more steady. "But I want you to know that I deeply regret what I did. I misjudged you, and I can't undo it, but I can learn from this, and I will." She swallowed hard, trying to hold back the lump in her throat. "I'm truly sorry for how I treated you." The woman finally spoke, her voice soft but unwavering. "Apologies are important, but actions speak louder than words," she said, her eyes not leaving Lisa's face. "You've shown that you can recognize when you've made a mistake. Now it's time to prove that you'll learn from it." Lisa nodded slowly, understanding the weight of the woman's words. She had heard the message loud and clear. This wasn't about just apologizing. It was about showing change. It was about making sure that what had happened never happened again. Lisa knew she had a long way to go, but this was the first step in taking responsibility for her actions. The other passengers, who had been watching this exchange in silence, began to stir. Some nodded in approval, while others exchanged quiet words of support. It was clear that the incident had left an impression on everyone. The woman had handled the situation with dignity and grace, and that alone had taught a valuable lesson about respect and fairness. Lisa, still standing in front of the woman, knew that this wasn't the end of the conversation. It couldn't be. The woman's message had been clear, and it was something Lisa would carry with her from that moment on. She would make sure to be more aware of her actions, to look beyond the surface and treat everyone with the respect they deserved, no matter who they were. The cabin finally began to settle, but the tension hadn't completely lifted. The lesson had been learned, though, and the journey ahead would be different for everyone involved. As the flight continued, the uneasy atmosphere in the cabin began to shift. The tension that had hung heavily in the air was starting to dissipate, but the impact of what had just happened remained. The passengers, who had been silently observing the exchange, now found themselves discussing it in quiet murmurs. Some looked at the woman with newfound respect, while others couldn't stop thinking about the flight attendant's mistake. It was clear that the events of the last few minutes had left a mark on everyone. Many of the passengers had been shocked by how calmly the woman had handled the situation. She had not raised her voice, had not made a scene, but her words carried weight. She had shown remarkable grace under pressure, a quality that made everyone realize just how wrong they had been to make assumptions based on appearances. Her composure had set a powerful example, not just for Lisa, but for everyone who had witnessed the incident. One by one, passengers started to speak up. It wasn't long before a couple of them approached Lisa, their expressions sympathetic but firm. They weren't angry at her, but they were disappointed. A man in his early 30s, who had been sitting a few rows behind the woman, spoke first. "Hey, I just want to say that what you did back there, that wasn't right," he said, his voice calm but direct. "You made an assumption about her based on how she looked, and that's not fair to anyone. I think we all learned something from this." Lisa nodded, her face flushing with embarrassment. "I know. I'm so sorry for what I did," she replied, her voice steady now, but there was a trace of regret in it. "I made a mistake, and I'll own up to it." The man gave her a small nod, then turned to the others sitting nearby. "It's important to treat people with respect. I think we can all agree on that." His words seemed to ripple through the cabin, and more passengers began to share their thoughts. There was a general sense of understanding that hadn't been there before. People were now talking about how they could do better, how they could be more aware of their own biases and assumptions. A woman sitting near the front of the plane, who had been listening to the conversation, chimed in. "I think what's most important is how the woman handled the whole thing," she said, glancing toward the woman in the first-class seat. "She didn't react with anger. She didn't try to make it worse. She showed us all how to respond to something like this with dignity. That's something we should all try to learn from." The woman in question, still sitting quietly in her seat, smiled softly at the comments, though she didn't engage in the conversation. She wasn't interested in being praised. She was more focused on the message that had come out of the situation. She had spoken her truth, and now others were taking that message to heart. The conversation continued as the flight moved forward, with more passengers reflecting on the lesson they had learned. Many of them had been guilty of judging others based on appearances or making assumptions about people they didn't know. But now, they understood the consequences of those actions. They realized that it wasn't just about one flight attendant making a mistake. It was about how society as a whole often failed to see people for who they truly were. Lisa, still in the galley, overheard these conversations. She listened intently, taking in the words of the passengers who had expressed their thoughts. She realized that this was a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone on that plane. The lesson was clear. It wasn't enough to simply apologize. It was about changing how you saw the world and how you treated others. She vowed to do better, to be more aware of her actions and the impact they had on the people around her. As the flight continued toward its destination, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The passengers, though quiet now, had learned something important. They had learned that respect wasn't something that should be given based on appearance or status. It was something that should be given to everyone, no matter who they were. And that lesson, though born from a difficult moment, was one they would carry with them long after the flight was over. The flight was nearing its final leg, and the once tense atmosphere had relaxed. The quiet murmurs from the passengers had quieted, but there was an undeniable shift in the way they all carried themselves. They had witnessed something rare, a moment of vulnerability, a mistake, and then a chance for growth. It wasn't just a simple flight anymore. The lessons learned would stay with them long after they had left the plane. Lisa, the flight attendant, moved through the aisles again, but this time, her movements were different. She wasn't just performing her job. She was reflecting on the past hours. Her thoughts swirled around the woman in first class, the words she had spoken, and the way the passengers had come together to acknowledge the situation. It had been a long, difficult realization, but Lisa now knew she couldn't go back to the way things were. The mistake she had made wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. It had been a lesson in how important it was to treat every person with the same respect, regardless of their background or appearance. As she walked past the woman's seat again, she couldn't help but glance at her. The woman was reading a book now, calm and composed as she had been from the start. Lisa stopped for a moment, standing beside the woman's seat. She hesitated, wondering if now was the right time to apologize once again. But before she could speak, the woman looked up from her book and smiled warmly. "There's no need for more apologies," she said gently, her voice still calm. "You've learned what you needed to learn." Lisa nodded, feeling the sense of relief mixed with the weight of everything that had happened. The woman's words were simple, but they carried a quiet understanding. Lisa felt that the incident had allowed her to grow in ways she hadn't expected. She hadn't just learned how to be a better flight attendant. She had learned how to be a better person. The woman closed her book and stood up, preparing for the final descent. Lisa, though still a little nervous, spoke up once more. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "for showing me a better way. I won't forget this." The woman smiled again, her eyes reflecting something deeper. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is how we move forward," she said, her tone thoughtful. "I hope that you'll always choose to move forward with respect and understanding." Lisa watched as the woman gathered her belongings and prepared to leave. There was no drama, no sense of finality in the air, just a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed. She had not only learned something important about respect, but had witnessed how powerful one person's calm response could be in turning a difficult situation around. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to gather their things, there was a renewed sense of unity among them. Everyone had been touched by the events of the flight, and many were still reflecting on the lessons they had learned. Some passengers exchanged small smiles, while others simply nodded as they exited. It was clear that this flight would be remembered, not for the awkward moment that had started it all, but for the way everyone had come together afterward to make something good out of a bad situation. For Lisa, the journey had been a turning point. She knew that the road to making lasting change wouldn't be easy, but she was committed to it. She wouldn't forget the woman in first class or the lesson she had learned. And as she moved forward in her career, she knew that every passenger she served deserved the same respect, no matter who they were. The flight might have ended, but the impact of that day would stay with them all, reminding them that respect, understanding, and kindness can change lives, one simple moment at a time.